Welcome everyone to Start, Sit, Stash, Quit Week 5. My name is Justin Boone, the lead fantasy analyst at theScore, and we've made it through the first month of the fantasy season. Now we have buys to deal with. They're starting this week, so you got to account for those when you're setting your lineups, and make sure you're keeping the matchups in mind too. That is a big part of your fantasy lineup decisions every week. So let's get to my favorite starts and sits for Week 5. Then we're going to talk about a couple players that you could be stashing on your bench, and some that you could just officially drop. And one of the drop candidates this week, it's been a long time coming here, just one of the biggest disappointments of the fantasy season so far, and I don't see it turning around, so we are going to let him go. But let's kick things off with the starts, and at quarterback, Brock Purdy versus the Cardinals. Last week, he got most of his weapons back. CMC hasn't returned yet, but he got Debo back, Kittle back, but he didn't need to do that much to beat the Patriots. Arizona's offense this week, they're going to push the 49ers a little bit more. The game has one of the highest totals on the week at 49.5. Cardinals are also a top 10 matchup for fantasy quarterbacks this season. And if you go back to last year, Purdy finished as a QB1 in both games against Arizona, including a 4-touchdown game in their last meeting. He is a very strong start in this one. At running back, DeAndre Swift versus Carolina. It finally happened. Swift came alive last week, 23 touches, 165 scrimmage yards. He found the end zone as well. He caught all 7 of his targets. It was a great game. The matchup was a big factor, though. He was going against the Rams, so that certainly helped get him going. But now this week, he's got another great matchup. Carolina giving up the second most fantasy points to running backs on the season, so don't be afraid to start Swift as a quality RB2 in Week 5. At receiver, Stephon Diggs versus my Bills. This is the huge revenge game. Everybody's been talking about it, and the players have played really nice so far. They've said the right things to the media, but it was obvious. Diggs Ward is welcome in Buffalo over the last couple seasons. That led to the trade to Houston. Now he's at home. He's getting to take on his old Bills squad, and Diggs seems like a guy who's going to be very motivated to put up a big game against that kind of team. So he went 10 for 94 a few weeks ago against the Vikings, who he used to play for. I guarantee he is going to come out hot in this one. So Buffalo has been good against fantasy wide receivers. I don't think it matters. I think Diggs is going to make his presence felt in this game. He's a high-end wide receiver too, with wide receiver 1 fantasy upside this week, if he can find the end zone. And I am sure that you're wondering which tight end that you should play, because tight end has been brutal so far. But we'll round out the starts with my tight end here, Tucker Kraft at the Rams. I talked about him on the Waiver Wire episode on the Score Fantasy Football podcast on Monday. I wrote about him in the Waiver Wire column. Hopefully you went out and picked him up. This is a guy who finished as a top 12 fantasy tight end over the final 8 weeks last season. And in Jordan Love's first game back since the opener, Kraft caught 6 passes for 53 yards and a touchdown. He drew 9 targets in that game. He is the clear starting tight end in one of the best offenses in football now that Love is healthy. And the Rams are giving up the 6th most fantasy points to his position. So Kraft, a top 10 fantasy tight end this week, and likely a fringe low-end tight end 1 the rest of the season. So those are some of my top starts. Who should you think about sitting in Week 5? And at quarterback, I would like to see you find a better option than my guy Dak Prescott. He's going up against the Steelers. It's not a great matchup. Plus, we found out on Wednesday, one of his receivers, Brandon Cooks, he's going to be out this week and might miss a few games. This was already a really thin receiving core behind CeeDee Lamb, so this is not ideal for Dak. Plus, going against the Steelers, they're only allowing the 6th most fantasy points to quarterbacks this season. Dak, really solid fantasy QB1 most games. I'm projecting more of a mid-range QB2 outing for him versus Pittsburgh's defense. So check out my waiver wire column, check out my rankings, see if guys like Justin Fields or Geno Smith or somebody like that's available. I would actually start them over Dak in Week 5. For my sit at running back, and as always, this one comes down to your options, because the bye weeks have started. You might not have a better option than this player, but Zach Moss is somebody that I think is going to have a down game this week. He's going up against the Ravens. Not a great matchup. I know he's had some pretty good stat lines lately, but he was also doing it against the Commanders, against the Panthers. Those are 2 of the easiest opponents for fantasy backs. Now he's got to go against the Ravens, who are the 3rd hardest opponent for RBs. They haven't allowed more than 45 rushing yards to any back this season. We also have to consider, too, that Chase Brown is getting a little more involved. That's been on the rise in recent weeks. Could this turn into more of a committee moving forward? I definitely think that's possible here with the way that Brown has played. So it's a tough defense. I would view Moss more as a high-end RB3 for fantasy this week. Maybe he can save his day with a touchdown, but I wouldn't bank on that. For my sit at receiver, Jacoby Myers at Denver. I think at this point, it would be a shock if we ever see Davante Adams suit up for the Raiders again. I think we could all agree on that. Seems like a trade's inevitable there. So that makes Myers the #1 wide receiver for the Raiders. And last week, with Adams out, Myers played a season-high 72% of his snaps out wide. The bad news, that's where Patrick Surtain resides for the Broncos. And Surtain and that Denver secondary, they've done an incredible job just erasing opponents' top wide receivers this season. They held DK Metcalf to 3 for 29, George Pickens to 2 for 29, Mike Evans to 2 for 17, Garrett Wilson to 5 for 41 last week. If Adams does get traded, and we already know he's out this week, but if he does get traded, Myers is going to be an intriguing wide receiver 3 the rest of the season. This isn't the week to play him, though. And then I've said this before, but finding a fantasy tight end to sit, that can be a fool's errand, especially now the bye weeks are hitting. It's such a tough thing to do, but I would try not to use Cole Kmet versus the Panthers. I know people got excited a few weeks ago, put up that 10-catch game in week 3, but that was with Keenan Allen out of the lineup. Last week, Keenan Allen active. It was back to what we expected before the season. You have 3 strong receivers in Allen and DJ Moore and Rome Odunze. That makes it very tough for Cole Kmet to earn targets, and unsurprisingly, he had just 3 passes thrown his way in week 4. So even in what should be a fairly decent matchup against the Panthers for Kmet, he's just more of a tight end 2 streamer type, not a fantasy tight end this week at all. But again, just finding a tight end that can give you like 5 to 8 fantasy points, that feels like a win right now just with the state of the position. So enough of the negative stuff. We got to go over it, but let's move on to some more positive things here. And that's the stashes. And I really think I got a couple good ones this week for you. The first is the rookie on the Patriots, Jalen Polk, 8% rostered right now, out there in over 90% of leagues. He was a second rounder this season for a reason. The Patriots have eased him into the offense in the first month, but now his playing time is rising. He went from less than 60% of the snaps in the first 3 weeks to 83% in week 4. He also led the team in targets in week 4 with 7. He has one of the best separation win rates for rookie wide receivers this year, according to Fantasy Points data suite. I think it's only a matter of time before this breakout occurs, and I know a lot of people are down on that Patriots offense, but Polk is a player that could help them get things going. I see him as the best wide receiver on New England already. And how often can you get a team's #1 receiver who's available in over 90% of fantasy leagues in October? I would go and scoop him up immediately before we see that breakout happen. And then my second stash, and this one is playing off the Davante Adams trade rumors, Trey Tucker on the Raiders, 11% rostered. The Raiders coaching staff, they talked him up all offseason. They highlighted him as a guy who made a really big jump from year 1 to year 2. And in the first couple weeks, he was stuck behind Adams, behind Myers. Only a few catches in those games, really didn't get on the fantasy radar. But since then, he's seen 15 targets the last 2 weeks. Posted stat lines of 7 for 96 and a touchdown in week 3, 5 for 41 last week. Also added a 3-yard touchdown in that game on the ground. If Adams is in fact done in Vegas like we expect, Tucker would be the #2 wide receiver in that offense the rest of the season. I think he's a potential wide receiver for flex play the rest of the year. And then let's finish off here with the quits for week 5. And these are guys who have been on my radar as possible drops the last couple weeks. I wanted to give them a chance to turn it around. Sadly, they haven't. And the first one is Mark Andrews. Everybody's been asking me whether they should drop this guy. He's 92% rostered still. This is one of the weirdest fantasy stories that I can remember. Just a star tight end completely falling off like this at the beginning of the next year. And it's not like he's being replaced, because outside of that big game in the opener, Isaiah Likely, his teammate, he hasn't done much either. But Andrews, just 1 game over 15 yards this season. The last 2 weeks, his playing time has plummeted. He's been held catchless in those 2 outings, only had 1 target in each of those games. And in week 4, he dropped that lone target, and it might have been one of the worst drops that I have ever seen. He was wide open, hit him right in the hands, fell to the ground. Just bizarre stuff. I know they're running the ball a lot. I think he must be hurt or something. Either way, you don't need to sit around and wait any longer. I think he can be dropped in fantasy. Hopefully there's a tight end on the waiver wire that you can go get and put in your lineup. And I also think that you can drop Zamir White on the Raiders. He's 66% rostered, started the season as the lead back there, wasn't a bit of a committee at that point, but we figured that when they got good game scripts, he would put up decent numbers. So far, been really subpar results for him. Hasn't done it even in the good matchups. The Panthers game, total bust in week 3, and everybody can run on the Panthers. And when he did hit 50 rushing yards for the first time all season last week, he also had a fumble in that game. So just unstartable for fantasy. His head coach, Antonio Pierce, he's saying Alexander Mattison has earned more opportunities in that backfield. Could we see him take over above Zamir White? I don't think there's any reason to hold on to White right now, especially with matchups against the Broncos and the Steelers in the next 2 weeks. But that is all for Start, Sit, Stash, Quit for this one. If you want more, you can find all my content over at theScore. Make sure you're listening to the Score Fantasy Football Podcast, which I host, and subscribe to theScore's No Timeouts YouTube channel. Make sure you're getting all our latest football videos every week.